Hi, this is Marie Eldridge. I'm joined today by our guest presenter, Kimmy Brunner. We're glad to have her with us, and I'm just going to give a little intro to Kimmy, and then I'm just going to turn the time over to her, and we have so much to learn from her. So Kimmy's been a machine quilting teacher of the year 2 times. She is an awesome teacher. If you've ever taken a class from her, she's written lots of books. More important, she is an amazing quilter. I love all the quilts that Kimmy's done, and she's given lots of help. She loves to share. She does magazine articles, and finally, she's an ambassador for Handi Quilter. I can go on and on. I love Kimmy. So, Kimmy, I just want to hear what you have to say, so let's get started.
Well, hello, Marie. Thanks for having me today.
We're way excited to have you, so you're in control. Let's get going.
All right. Let's talk about Trapunto. Trapunto, in case you don't know what it is, it's the art of using batting to create dimensional effects on your quilts. And as you can see by looking at this picture, it really can totally transform the look of your quilt. It can take a quilt that's kind of blah and not very exciting and make it really, really pop. It's a very old technique. It's found on one of the oldest known quilts in the world. And it can sometimes look really intimidating and difficult to beginner quilters, but it's really not. It's so much easier than it looks. Trapunto can be accomplished by all quilters, regardless of how they're accomplishing their quilting. You can do it if you're a stand-up quilter, a sit-down quilter, even hand quilters can do it. The technique is the same. The only thing that changes is how you execute that technique. But the end result is the same no matter how you execute. No matter how you get there, you get to the same place. Before you commit to doing a Trapunto quilt, you need to be aware that this technique is going to take more time than the traditional quilting design plan. It's not difficult, but it is going to require some time from you. You should not let this scare you away because the results are so totally worth it, and you can really get a cool-looking quilt out of it in the end.
Oh, yeah, we can see just from your example the difference in the Trapunto.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. I'm going to start by giving you kind of a Cliff Notes version of Trapunto, and then we'll go step by step through the various procedures. But I'll start with the easy version just so you kind of get a good overview of what we're going to be talking about. Before you get started, you are going to draw out your designs or your placement marks. And you're going to mark really carefully because you need to be really precise in your stitching. You're going to sandwich your quilt top with the Trapunto batting only. No backing fabric, no additional batting, just the Trapunto batting. You're going to first stitch out only the Trapunto designs. And you'll use either basting stitches or a special thread that we'll talk about in a minute. These first stitches are temporary and you're going to remove them later, so you don't have to be super precise in this first pass of stitching. After you've stitched out your Trapunto designs, you're going to cut away the excess batting, leaving batting only behind the designs that are going to be Trapunto. So your quilt is going to look pretty weird for a little bit, but it'll turn out great. The quilt is sandwiched again, this time using your normal batting and your backing fabric. So your quilt sandwich is now going to have a quilt top, designs that have been stitched out and padded with the Trapunto batting, a layer of normal batting, and your backing fabric. So are you still with me? Then you reload your quilt onto the machine. Doesn't matter what kind of machine you're using because remember you end up at the same place no matter how you execute it. You finish your quilting. You re-stitch your Trapunto designs. This time the stitches are permanent, so you have to be more careful. You pay special attention to heavily quilting your backgrounds because the flatter you get your backgrounds, the more your Trapunto is going to pop right off the quilt. When your quilting is complete, you remove that first pass of stitching, the temporary stitches, and to increase the dimension created by Trapunto, you're going to block your quilt. Blocking gives you a flatter, more square quilt, and it dramatically increases the pop of your Trapunto. If you don't know how to block a quilt, visit the Learn page at my website because I've got a free detailed set of instructions that show you exactly how to block a quilt. It walks you through the whole thing. Once you're done, your finished quilt is now available for admiration by all who see it. Now would you like to hear the step-by-step version? You're going to need some specific tools. You're probably going to have a lot of these on hand, but if you don't have them, it's not a big deal. You can easily pick them up from the local quilt shop or fabric store. The first thing that you're going to need is a fine line marker. I like the Dritz fine line water soluble marker, but if you don't like the water soluble, you can use an air erasable marker. The key is making sure that it's a fine line marker. Some of these markers have kind of a wider, almost like a felt tip-like mark, and that mark can be a little bit wider than you want because it doesn't show you precisely where you need to line things up. So make sure that you're getting a marker with a really super fine line. The finer the mark, the more accurate your designs are going to be. Remember that you want to test the marker before you use it because you are going to cry like a baby if those marks don't come out later on. To test the marker, it's super simple. You just take it. You just take your fabric, you take your marker, you make a couple of little marks on the fabric, and then you wet them with water or let the air get to them if it's an air erasable marker. Just make sure that the marks are going to come out completely and not leave any traces behind.
Okay, yes, Kimmy, I'm saying right
here. You're
here.
going to need some Trapunto.
Can you hear me?
You're going to need some Trapunto batting. Marie, can you hear me?
There we go. I was just going to tell you, if I have marks, I'm going to call you and cry.
Yeah, don't call me and cry, because the first thing I'm going to say is, did you pre-test this marker? Because if you didn't pre-test it and they don't come out, you're doomed. The next thing that you're going to want is Trapunto batting. The batting that you choose is the key to the success of your Trapunto designs. Trapunto is supposed to show, so make sure that you get the right batting. You want it to be nice and lofty. As you can see in the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, that the Trapunto batting that I'm holding there is a little over a ½ inch thick. But even more important than thickness is the density of the batting. You want a super dense batting that will hold its loft and not crush. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see I'm holding 2 samples of batting, one on the top, one on the bottom. The one on the bottom is a wool, and it's got that same ½ inch loft, but it's really airy and light and fluffy. There's no density, no thickness to it. The batting on the top is my Trapunto batting, and that is really super dense. It's not going to crush, it's going to hold its own. It's going to keep that Trapunto popping on that quilt for a long time to come. So don't base your batting choice simply on loft, base it on the density of that loft. You can play around a little bit with different batting choices to experiment with different effects. If you get a softer and lower loft bat, you're going to have a nice subtle effect. If you get a super dense 20-ounce batting, you're going to have super tight Trapunto motifs, which are really cool, but maybe they're not what you want for this quilt. Make up a little sampler so that you can see exactly how each batting is going to behave, and then you can decide which batting is the right choice for this quilt. Just remember, though, you don't want to go too subtle because your Trapunto is supposed to show. If you're going to do all the work of executing Trapunto, you want to make sure that that Trapunto really stands out so that you can enjoy it every time that you look at this quilt. You're going to need basting thread or a water-soluble thread. If the design is pretty complex and it's going to require a lot of quilting, or I'm going to stitch out a lot of designs to Trapunto, I'm going to use water-soluble thread simply because it's easier to remove. You need to match your bobbin thread to the color of your quilt top, because when you use water-soluble thread, that bobbin thread is not going to be removed from the quilt. It's going to stay put, and you need to make sure that it's not going to ghost through your top fabric and ruin the look of your finished quilt. For example, if you've got a white top, you want to make sure that you're either using white thread or a very light natural thread so that it's not going to show through your white top when the quilt is done. Most thread companies have their own version of water-soluble thread. It's super easy to use. You use the same needle you would always use. Most of the time, you're going to have to loosen up your tension a turn or two. It is slightly more fragile because it's meant to fall apart when you're done with it. So you need to loosen that tension, otherwise it's just going to shred as you're trying to run it. Remember, when you are choosing which brand to buy, you get what you pay for, and all threads are not created equal. I have a friend of mine who spent some time living in the southeastern part of the United States where it gets really hot and humid during the summer. During one spring she had done some Trapunto work with her water-soluble thread, and she never got around to doing the rest of the quilting, so she set it aside for the summer because she golfs all summer long and never quilts. When fall came and she was ready to start quilting again, she pulled that quilt out of storage and found that the humidity in the air had dissolved all of her water-soluble thread. So you need to make sure that you're buying a good quality thread that will last as long as you want it to last. You don't want that thread to disappear until you make it disappear. So spend a little bit of extra money and get a good quality thread. Okay, now I want you to pay attention to this part because it's important. You're going to have two different products on your quilt, both of which have very specific removal needs which you have to follow. You have to remove those products in the proper order or you're going to have problems. The water-soluble thread has to be removed with cold water. I'm sorry, the water-soluble pen has to be removed with cold water. Heat sets those pen marks and it makes them permanent. So you've got to use super cold water and you've got to get all of the marks out before you apply any heat to your quilt top. The water-soluble thread requires very warm, almost hot water to remove it. So you can see why you have to get those pen marks off before you get the thread off. If you try to get the thread off first and you submerge the quilt in hot water, you're going to set your pen marks. So get the pen marks off first and get them off thoroughly, and then you just dunk your quilt in really warm water and it melts the thread and makes it go away. The thing that I use to help me remember the order in which to remove them is your pen went on first to mark your designs, and then your thread stitched your designs. So the pen was first, the thread was second, the pen gets removed first, and the thread gets removed second. Does that make sense? When I'm doing a simple design that's going to require less stitching, or if I'm only going to Trapunto a couple of elements, and I don't want to, I'm not going to do a whole ton of stitching, I can easily baste my designs in place using a fine, strong white thread, and then I just pull my stitches out later. It's a little bit easier than having to remove the water-soluble thread. The reason that I use a white thread is because a white thread will not crock or leave bits of dye behind itself. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but like if you've done basting stitches with a red thread on a white fabric, sometimes your red dye can rub off of your red thread and leave little tiny marks behind. You don't want to have little marks showing where your basting stitches were, so you're just going to want to use white thread that will go on and come off without leaving a trace of itself behind. You're going to need 1 or 2 pairs of sharp, super small scissors, and the key words here are sharp and small. When you are trimming away your Trapunto batting, you're going to be taking really short little bites out of the batting. So go with short blades for extra control. You don't want to use your great big long shears because that's going to lead you to take long cuts, and that's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to cut a hole in your quilt top. You want nice little tiny blades that you can take little bitty snips out of.
Okay, Kimmy, so we got a little typo on there.
Choose a suitable design.
Kimmy?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
What happened?
Your instructions.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so your instructions said you're going to take little bites out of the fabric. So I want to make sure everybody understood you're going to take bites out of the batting.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
We're doing good. Keep going.
Okay. I just want to make sure you can see everything I can see. For those of you who are listening to us right now, I'm in Minnesota and Marie is in Utah. So through the wonders of technology, we're able to do that, or do this, but sometimes technology can kind of get in your way. Okay, back to our subject. You want to make sure that you are choosing a suitable design. Now is not the time for the most elaborate design you've ever seen in your whole life. Remember, your Trapunto design is going to need to have all of that batting precisely trimmed away from behind it. So you don't necessarily want to choose a super elaborate design with lots of little tiny nooks and crannies. You have to look at how am I going to get in there and trim that batting out of those nooks and crannies. Make it easier on yourself and don't choose something that is going to be impossible to trim properly. Clean, strong lines are going to work better than designs with tiny, fussy little details, and clean, strong lines will also show off your Trapunto a little bit better than a tiny, fussy little design will. When you're laying out your design work, be creative. You want to use stencils, you want to use parts of stencils, you want to use a little bit of this and a little bit of that to create a design that is unique and one of a kind and not a design that you're going to see on everybody else's quilt. If you've got a Pro Stitcher, think about combining templates and your Pro Stitcher designs to give you the look of perfect work. You want to make this design yours. If you're going to do the work at Trapunto, make it your design. Don't just make it a cookie cutter copy of somebody else's work. That quilt has already been made. Now you make your own quilt. Okay, let's get started. Before I start working on a Trapunto quilt, I spend a couple of minutes doing a rough sketch of my design plan to make sure that it's going to look the way that I think it's going to look. The last thing that I want is to do all of the work of Trapunto and have the quilt kind of fall flat on its face. So I'm going to draw it out just to make sure that everything looks the way I think it should look. And when I say I draw it out, I don't spend like a million hours drawing out every little tiny detail. I just get my basic design idea down on paper. I figure out my spacing. I look to see if I need to adjust lines here or there. If you look at the picture in front of you right now and you look in the lower left corner, my original design was to have a circle on the outside and then kind of a pointed arc shape on the inside of that ring. But when I drew it out, I thought, you know what, that's not how I want it to look at all. Then I drew the design on the lower right with double rings, and I thought, yeah, that is way better. I figured out the spacing of my little circles on paper because it's a whole lot easier to redraw on paper than it is to stitch out one design and then go, oh yeah, that's no good, I need to rip it out and restitch another one. So I get everything on paper, make sure it's lined up the way I want it to be, and then I go to my fabric. Basically, like it says, I make sure it looks as good out of my head as it does in my head before I move to my fabric. Once you're sure of your layout, it's time to mark. And remember that you can only line things up accurately if you mark them accurately, so take the time to do it right. You want to mark your stitching lines, your spacing lines, and your placement lines so that everything ends up where it should be, where it belongs. The thing that you want to remember is that crooked Trapunto elements really, really show a lot because Trapunto shows, and if it's crooked, it shows. You're going to be stitching your Trapunto designs out twice, so make sure that you make those marks dark enough so that you can see them clearly and easily during both stitching passes. If you're using a stencil, make sure that you mark all of the elements of that stencil so that there's no guesswork involved. If you've got an elaborate stitching path, make sure you draw it all out so that you can see it and know, okay, I go here, I zip over there, I go down there. If you are going to use a digitized design, make sure you accurately mark your crosshairs and your guidelines so that you can mark it, stitch it, and line it up perfectly the second time without having to guess where it's supposed to go. Sometimes your quilt is going to make it easy, and it's going to have seam lines that create the X that marks the spot, like you see on the left. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of manual marking. If you look at the yellow quilt on the right, you'll see I put straight lines in to help me guide the peaks of my arches. I put little tick marks just below the pieced squares to show me where the low point of my arches should go. I've got an X in the middle to show me where my motif should be. I basically put in all the marks that I needed to get everything lined up perfectly every single time. So as you're marking, take some time to think, which marks do I need to put on here to help me place my stitching lines perfectly 2 times in a row. Either way, you need to stitch it. You need to stitch that second pass right on top of the first pass, so put in enough guidelines to make it easier on yourself. The easier the job is, the more fun you'll have and the better your quilt will turn out. Okay, you've got your quilt all marked, you're ready to start quilting. First thing you do is load up your batting. If you are stitching on a sit-down machine, you know how to sandwich your quilt. You're just going to use some safety pins and pin your quilt top onto your batting. If you're using a mid-arm or a long arm, you're going to load your batting just like it's the backing fabric. You pin it onto the top leader, you pin it onto the bottom leader. It's no different than fabric. The only change is you cannot tighten your leaders tightly because your batting will start to shred. So It's not like fabric in that way, but in every other way you can treat it just like it is fabric. So pin it onto the top, pin it onto the bottom, make sure you've got nice straight edges, top and bottom, pin it in place, and lay your quilt top on top of the batting, baste it into place at the top and down the sides so that it doesn't shift. This first pass of stitching is just preliminary, so you don't have to spend a whole bunch of time fussing with tensioning your quilt. You just want it tight enough to keep it in place so that it doesn't shift while you're stitching out your trapunto designs. If you over tighten that batting, it's going to start shredding and pulling apart, so keep a nice medium loose tension on it.
Kimmy?
When you are tensioning your thread, yes,
Kimmy? Do you have to worry about the batting? Do you have to worry about the batting and your hopping foot or any of that, or it just quilts over it?
It quilts right over it. If you were to use maybe a 20-ounce super dense, super thick batting, you might need to raise your hopping foot a little bit, but if you stick with a 16-ounce or lighter batting, and remember the picture I showed you with the batting that was about a ½ inch thick? That's a 16-ounce. So if you've got anything that thick or lighter, you'll be able to stitch it with no adjustments at all to your hopping foot. Does that answer your question?
That answers my question. Yep.
Okay, perfect. It's going to help you in stitch removal if you have loose tension, especially if you're basting that first pass of stitching. Perfect tension is going to make it more difficult to rip, so this is the one time that you really want to have bad tension. Loosen up that tension so that you can pull those stitches out. You also want to have loose tension if you're stitching with water-soluble thread, because that thread is fragile. It's going to need a loose tension or it's going to start shredding and falling apart on you. So if you're stitching along and all of a sudden your thread starts shredding every third stitch, or if you start getting a lot of breaks, just loosen up your tension by a turn or two. Again, you don't care about good tension. These stitches are coming out anyway, so it doesn't matter if you've got loops. It doesn't matter if the stitches are just laying there looking terrible. All you want to do at this point is just temporarily hold that batting in place just long enough to trim it away and get the quilt back on the machine. So don't worry about your tension. When you are stitching, use care in placement because it's going to make the second pass of stitching so much easier. In this example, I'm stitching out a digitized design. My seam lines made the X that marks the spot for my design placement. So I'm going to very carefully position my needle right where those two lines come together. And on my Pro Stitcher, I made darn sure that that line, that center point was right in the center of my design. Because I lined it up carefully the first time, I will be able to more easily line it up the second time. Because this is my first stitching pass, I set my stitches per inch to 8 to make it easier to remove those stitches. I would have liked to have gone down to 4 or 6 stitches per inch, but that would have given me squared off little circles, and I didn't want that, so I had to bump it up to 8 stitches per inch to get nice round circles so that I would have nice round shapes to do my second pass of stitching around. And when I was coming up for a design idea on this quilt, I liked my little snowman, and I wanted to kind of play up the snowman aspect. This quilt is being made as a sample for a show in South Africa that I'm going to be doing in a couple weeks. And I figured, you know, they don't have snowmen there. This would be kind of a cute quilt to do for a show in a place where they don't have snowmen. So I wanted a design that would echo the snowman aspect of this quilt. So I used my Art and Stitch program, and I simply came up with a really easy little design that looks like little snowmen. Bigger circle, medium circle, small circle, repeated it 4 times, and boom, I've got 4 little snowmen for the middle of my quilt. If you do not have a Pro Stitcher and you want to stitch something out that's similar, you would just use little circle templates. There are a number of them on the market. You just plop the template down, stitch around it, and you've got yourself a little circle. The first stitching pass is for trapunto elements only. And remember that all of your other design work is saved for the second pass. So in this case, you can see I stitched those little snowmen in the center, and then I stitched my big loopy rings around them. And lining up those big loopy rings was super easy. all I did was take 2 circle templates. One of them is about an 8.5-inch circle, the other is a 9-inch circle. I laid them down on the quilt. If we're looking at the quilt and we look at the little snowman in the top left-hand corner, I laid down my circle on top of him so that the right-hand side of my circle was just touching that center seam line that goes from north to south, and the bottom of my circle template was resting on that seam line that goes from east to west. I dropped my needle at the east-west seam line, stitched up and around that circle template until it came to the next seam line and stopped with my needle down. I shifted my circle template over and put it on top of that little top right-hand snowman, lined it up again so that this time the left-hand side of the circle is laying on that north-south seam line. The bottom of the circle was laying on the east-west seam line. Stitched 3/4 of the way around again. Stopped when my needle hit the seam line. Shifted the template down to the lower right-hand snowman. Lined up the top of the circle template with that east-west seam. And lined up the left-hand side of the circle with the north-south seam. Stitched 3/4 of the way around. Shifted it to the final snowman. Stitched 3/4 of the way around, and I had completed one pass of that kind of cloverleaf design. I ended my stitching line, grabbed the larger circle, and did the same thing, lining it up the same way. Started in the upper left, lining up the right-hand side of my circle with the seam line and the bottom of my circle with the seam line, stitched up and around, shifted and stitched, shifted and stitched, shifted and stitched. So now I've got 4 passes of 2 circles going around the outside of the snowman and 4 little sets of snowmen in the center. So that's my trapunto work. Now it's time to start cutting away the excess. When you cut, you're going to start by cutting away the bulky excess first just to get it out of the way. I didn't need any of that batting that was on the outside of the cloverleaf, so the first thing I did was cut it off, get it out of the way. When you're cutting, remember I said you're going to take little tiny snips. You're cutting maybe an inch at a time, and that's it. You don't take long snips. The longer the snips that you take, the more you increase the likelihood that you're going to cut a hole in your quilt top. So you very carefully hold onto your quilt, kind of peel it away from the batting, nestle your scissors right up next to the stitching line, and just take little tiny snip, snip, snip all the way around the circle. Snip away all your excess backing, all your excess batting from the outside, and then you move to the inside and remove the excess backing or batting from the inside as well. I like to start with the bulky stuff first, and then I do the fine tuning. So when I move to the inside of those 4 large circles, I cut away the big chunks first, and then I went in and carefully trimmed so that I got right up close to my stitching lines. I don't try to do that careful trimming at first, because then you're just dealing with a whole lot of batting that's flopping around and getting in your way. So cut the excess stuff first, get it out of the way, and then go in and do your fine tuning. So what you end up with is a quilt top that just has little bits of batting stuck here and there on the back, and those little bits of batting are only where you want your trapunto designs to be. Now it's time to load that quilt back on the machine, or to sandwich it up again. If you're going to do your stitching on a domestic machine, you just sandwich it as you normally would, and you go back in and do all of your finish work. You do the background work, you do your stitching in the ditch, all that finish work that you want to do. And when choosing your fill work that you're going to use to surround your trapunto motifs, remember that the greater the contrast, the greater the pop on your trapunto. Straight motifs are really going to sing when they're surrounded by curvy lines. Curvy lines are going to be shown to greater advantage by straight fill work. Above all, though, you want to use fairly tight fills for your background work because you really want to smash the living daylights out of that quilt. Smashing the backgrounds down causes your trapunto to lift very dramatically off the surface of your quilt, and that's what you want. So you can use stippling, you can use bubbling, you can, whatever kind of fill work that you want to use, go ahead and use it. Just remember you want to smash the living daylights out of the backgrounds. when your quilting is complete, it's time to remove that first pass of stitching. If you use plain thread to baste, you're simply going to pull those stitches out using your seam ripper. If you used water-soluble thread, you're going to need to use water to remove it, but remember what I said about getting the pen marks out first. Cold water removes the marks, warm water removes the thread. And before we go any further, let me just throw in that when you are doing a trapunto quilt and you know you're going to have to get it wet, you want to make sure that the fabric that you use to piece that quilt is not going to run, because you don't want to do all this beautiful quilting and then get the quilt wet to get the marks out only to find that dye runs all over the place and now you've got a problem with dye. So make sure that you've pre-washed, and when you wet the quilt to remove the marks and the thread, make sure you throw a couple of color catchers or some Synthropol in the water to help keep that dye from resettling onto your quilt and marring it. Remember to block that quilt. I know that you're sick and tired of the quilt and you want it to be done now, but really blocking is going to make a huge difference. It gives you a very crisp and professional finished look to your quilt. It makes your trapunto jump right off of the quilt. It only takes a little bit of work, but it has a huge impact and it's well worth the time. And you know what? If you use water-soluble thread or blue pen marks, you have to get your quilt wet anyway, so you might as well go to the work of blocking it, because getting it wet is half the work. Let me show you before and after on this quilt. Here's the before the trapunto. As you can see, it's a cute little quilt. All I did was embroider a couple of little snowmen. I got a new sewing machine, so I had to do something to show off my new sewing machine. I just pieced those little triangles using one of the triangle paper piecing techniques, so I got nice little perfect points. That's what it looked like before. And here's what it looks like after with trapunto. You can see it makes a huge difference, and it really does not take that much extra time, and it's certainly not a difficult process. You can see my little snowman motif in the center. You can see my curvy circular motifs going around my snowmen. If you look in the four corners, you'll see that I repeated those little snowmen motifs, but I didn't trapunto those. And the reason for that was trapunto can really kind of take over a quilt if you use too much of it. And I knew that if I trapuntoed those motifs in the corner, it was going to be more trapunto than this quilt could handle. So you kind of want to, there's a very fine line that you don't want to cross with trapunto. A little bit of trapunto is great, but a lot of trapunto can sometimes be really a lot of trapunto. So don't throw too much on there, and think about where it's going to be most effective, but don't get too carried away. So I trapuntoed my center motifs, but not my corner motifs. By adding those corner motifs in, I have repetition, which makes for a more pleasing quilt, but by avoiding trapuntoing them, I didn't add too much to the quilt. And as you can see, I did a lot of straight line work for my background because that contrasts beautifully with those nice curving lines. And the fill work I did around my little snowman is just kind of a mix of curvy lines and bubbles and micro stippling, which I think kind of looks like snow. Here in Minnesota, we have a lot of snow in the winter, and so we get to watch it all winter long, swirling around in little dips and hollows. And that background fill work kind of reminds me of snow blowing around in the winter time. So, but again, it's nice and flat, so it makes my trapunto motifs really pop right off of the quilt. It gives me a lot of really cool dimension. If you need more information on blocking, there's also a lot of other free topics, free articles on different topics that are useful and helpful. Go to my website. Feel free to use anything that you find there. And if you want to do some shopping, you can enter HQ Trapunto in the comments section, and I will give you a discount. And if you have any questions, I would love for you to send them in so that we can answer them for you. Marie, do you have any questions on what we talked about?
Okay, so we've sort of had some trouble with the sound going back and forth, so I've tried to not bring out the questions that we had. So I just want to remind our viewers that all of this is going to be printed up, and you can see it online on Monday. All these instructions, you did such a good job of, everything is pretty much there printed for instructions. So we do answer the questions that come in, and we'll go through those between us and forwarding those on to Kimmy. So you will get answers to your questions if we didn't address them during this. So I am amazed. That is such a transformation from the first one to that one. It's beautiful.
It really does make a big difference, doesn't it?
It makes a huge difference. That is just, beautiful.
And you know, it's not that much extra work. When you break it down into little steps, I mean, you look at the quilt and you think, oh boy, that's a lot of quilting. But when you break it down, it's like, you know what, this really is way easier than it looks. And the trapunto itself, I mean, all I did was stitch some circles. That's not difficult. And then I cut away the batting, and that's not difficult either. So you can see when you take the quilt and break it down into little baby steps, all of a sudden it gets a whole lot easier than you think it's going to be. And it makes such a big impact on your finished quilt and really gives you a project that you can feel really proud of and really pleased about.
Yes, this one is a hit. We love this. So beautiful. And just, yeah, like you say, the tips are so easy. I'm going to try this, Kimmy.
You better. And remember, pre-test your marking pen and don't come crying to me if it doesn't come out.
Okay. Oops, still there. Okay, and one other question. Did you quilt inside the snowman at all or just around the outside?
No, I didn't. Those snowmen are very small. They're only each about 3.5 inches tall, so they're really tiny. And I kind of wavered on, am I going to quilt them, am I not going to quilt them? But they are small enough that they did not need to be quilted on the inside, and they don't flop. However, if they were bigger, like if they were 6-inch snowmen, then yes, I definitely would have quilted inside of them because that's just too much. With all that dense background quilting behind them, that would be way too much space to leave unquilted. So you have to kind of balance how big is your motif and how much room, how much space are you leaving unquilted. If you leave too much space open, it's going to flop and it's not going to look good. Did that answer your question?
That answered my question. Yep.
Perfect. Do you have any more?
Any more questions? I do have one that came in about, will you be offering a pattern for this?
No, I have no pattern. I just found, like I said, I got a new sewing machine and I wanted to play with the embroidery function. So I just found some little snowmen. All I did was cut out big white squares and I embroidered my snowmen so they were slightly off center. And then I just cut the squares out to, cut them down to size and used the triangle piecing paper. I think it was Tada triangles to piece those triangles around the outside. And let me back up a little bit. Before I cut my big white embroidered squares down to size, I figured out what size they needed to be cut down to in order to make my strips of triangles fit. So I kind of cheated my way through that one. I pieced up a strip of triangles and I thought, okay, my snowman squares need to be X number of inches in order to fit these triangles, and that's what I cut my snowman squares to. And after that, it was just a matter of applying 4 strips of pieced triangles to 4 embroidered squares, and that was all. So you can do it. It's an easy little pattern. You can definitely just make it up as you go along, because that's usually what I end up doing with my quilts. I just make them up as I go along.
But we all want to be like Kimmy. We want to quilt like this.
Well, come on over to my house. Come on over. We'll have coffee. We'll do some quilting. It'll be great.
We're there. We're coming. We're on our way.
Good. I'm not going to clean, just so you know. I'm not cleaning before you come over.
Oh, well, now it sounds more fun.
Yay.
Okay, so where are we at? Are we ready for discounts?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said, are we ready to talk about discounts, or are you still?
No, if you have no more questions, then let's talk about the discounts.
Oh, we all want to bargain, right?
Yes, we do. As I said a few minutes ago, if you come to my website, if there's any shopping that you want to do, if you enter HQ Trapunto in the comments section, I will give you a 20% discount on your purchase. That offer is good for a week from today. And if you want more information and more in-depth information about Trapunto, I just finished a 3-part series in Machine Quilting Unlimited magazine. Those the series appears in the May, June, July, August, and September, October issues. September, October is probably just about ready to go on the newsstand, and July and August might still be on the newsstand. You can find that at Joann's or at Barnes & Noble booksellers, or you can go visit them on the web at mqumag.com. And if you enter Handi Quilter as the promotional code, they will give you a 20% off discount on a year-long subscription. So if you want more information, go ahead and check out those articles. I was able to give you more information than the articles than I could ever give you in a webinar. It's 3 long articles, so you'll be bored stiff reading, but they're pretty informative. And I will let you talk about the rest of the discounts, Marie, because the rest of it is all Handi Quilter stuff.
Okay, just advance to the next one. Next slide.
All right.
And we'd like to thank you for joining us today. And like I mentioned before, you do not have to remember all of this. Kimmy has graciously put it in the magazines and told us where we can find that. You'll also be able to find it on our website. We'll have this posted under webinars on Monday, and if you go there, you're going to see something new. We've changed our website, so Handi Quilter has a new look. You should be able to still find us, find education and webinars. And we also have another coming up. Kimmy, if you want to advance. We just added 2 more educational retreats. We've had such a big demand for retreats. We're having a hard time having enough space to help everyone, so we'd like to invite you to register for October 6th to the 9th, the basic retreat, or a Pro Stitcher retreat available the 9th to the 12th. So you can also put both of those in. You can go to our website and sign up for those if you're interested. Okay. We are also at 20% discount, 20% off all educational DVDs, and there's the promotional code for that. Let's see. So we'll leave this here for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll have Kimmy go back to her slide that has her discount information also. But we really are so impressed and so excited with all the things we've learned today, Kimmy. Thank you so much for joining us, for all you shared with us, especially the eye candy, that quilt at the end. That was just an eye popper. So thanks so much, Kimmy, for being with us today. And I'm just going to turn this back to you if you have any other things to add.
I am so glad that you feel like you learned something. I hope that you will give this a try on your own quilts. You know, as you saw, it's really not difficult at all. It just takes a little bit of extra time commitment. You need to be patient, especially when you're cutting that batting away. If you try and rush it, you're going to run into a problem, but if you're patient and you move slowly and carefully, you'll be just fine. So I hope that I will see lots and lots of pictures of people's quilts that have been trapuntoed. I hope that you will think about maybe combining your Pro Stitcher work with your template work and your freehand work to make some really cool, very unique designs. And remember, if you make something cool, let's see a picture of it. Share it on Facebook or put it on the Handi Quilter page on Facebook. Let me see what you did with what you learned today. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening. I'm glad that you shared part of your nice summer day with us, and I hope you feel like you learned something. Thanks.